the prophet, near the end of the book of 2 Kings. By her point in the story, we have wound our way through most of the history of the kings of the Hebrew people, which begins in the king's account with David, the king most closely aligned with God's heart. After David's son Solomon builds the temple, the Lord visits Solomon and lays out the expectation that Solomon shall walk before God as David his father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, keeping all of God's commands and statutes. We know the essence of these commands as love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your mind, have no other gods before me, and love your neighbor as yourself. You may remember that Solomon's foreign wives turned his heart away from God when in his old age he built high places so that they could make sacrifices to their gods. This roused the Lord's anger and roused the Lord's promise that the kingdom would suffer from Solomon's actions. This promise started spooling out through Solomon's sons, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. In their struggle for power, the kingdom split apart, with Jeroboam taking 11 of the 12 tribes for himself as the northern kingdom of Israel. Rehoboam took the remaining tribe of Judah in the south and kept claim on Jerusalem. Figuring that if his people kept coming to Jerusalem to worship, he would lose them to his brother, Jeroboam crafted 2 golden calves and established them as places of worship for the people of Israel. He set one in the south at Bethel and one in the north at Dan. He created high places for worship, named priests who were not Levites, and scheduled festivals that were not part of the traditional calendar of the Hebrew people. The name of Jeroboam and his apostate ways stained the history of the kings of Israel for the next 200 years, until the kingdom fell into the grip of Assyria and was no more. Of many of the 18 kings who followed Jeroboam, it was said, he did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he caused Israel to commit. Meanwhile, in the south, the 13 kings of Judah between Rehoboam and Josiah of today's story played out a more checkered history. Some kings didn't follow the Lord at all. Some were more faithful to God's ways. When you look at even their stories, though, you find a version of this litany of disappointment. Nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. The people continued to sacrifice and make offerings on the high places. Josiah's great-grandfather Hezekiah held a bright spot in the history, destroying the high altars and following in the ways of God. But his son Manasseh doubled down on evil, God-forsaking ways, and the brightness vanished. Now, in Josiah's time, repairs are being made on the temple, and the high priest Hilkiah finds a book of laws in a previously overlooked corner. Hilkiah gives the book to King Josiah's secretary, Shaphan, who reads it to the king. The words of the law tear into Josiah's heart. As he recognizes how far Judah has sunk beneath the commandments of the Lord, he tears his clothing in the ritual way of showing his distress and grief. Then Josiah sends Hilkiah, Shaphan, and the 3 others of his close circle to consult about this book with Huldah, the prophet. Is it really the word of the Lord? What can it mean for Judah's uneven faithfulness to God's ways? And Huldah, the prophet of the Lord, assuring them that the book of the laws is indeed authentic, offers a blistering forecast from the mouth of the Lord, the God of Israel. It's too late. God's anger has been ignited by generations of leaders not closely following God's ways, and God's anger will not be put out. The inhabitants of Judah are going to be a desolation and a curse. She offers Josiah God's promise that because of Josiah's repentant heart, he at least will not see the disaster that is coming to his people. The word Huldah receives from the Lord launches Josiah into a tsunami of religious reform. His decrees and actions fill almost 4 columns of closely spaced text in the Bible that I read. Tragically, so say the Deuteronomic historians, even that earnest and thorough reform was not enough to appease God's wrath, and God gave Judah over to the Babylonians. So to Huldah, the prophet. There's precious little to really know about her. The text tells us that she lived in the Mishnah, the second quarter of Jerusalem, which is an area just northwest of the temple enclosure. We know that a pair of gates in the southeast corner of the temple were named for her. You can see pictures of them on the internet. We know that Huldah was considered one of the 7 Nebiah, women prophets in the Hebrew Bible. We know from Elizabeth Willett that the Nebiah were respected spiritual leaders and had free access to the kings, whom they frequently reprimanded. We can wonder whether Josiah consulted regularly with Huldah. We can surmise, along with writer Arthur Ide, that Huldah was the most educated, honest, and trustworthy person of her time. We can imagine, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that Huldah was a professor of law or of languages, and that she had a legal mind of surpassing insight. We can be sure with Wilda Gaffney that Huldah's prophetic authority was at the heart of Josiah's legislation of the monotheistic worship of Yahweh as the only legitimate expression of Israelite religion. Richard Rohr says that there are 2 ways to be a prophet. One way is to tell the enslaved that they can be free. That is the difficult path of Moses. The second, and I paraphrase here, is to tell those who think they are free that they are in fact enslaved. That is the difficult path of Huldah. Behind Huldah's oracle is her deep understanding that it is the ways of God that lead to life. What her beloved and exasperating people have given themselves over to does not lead to life. I believe that at the core of God's ways is a vision of covenant community in which we make sacred commitment to the well-being of each one. We live our commitment by walking after the attributes of the Holy One. I gathered this language from Rabbi Jack Paskoff in our yesterday's class. We live our commitment by walking after the attributes of the Holy One. We tend to the bountiful resources we have been given for life. We feed the hungry. We care for the sick. We demand justice for the marginalized. We express God's compassion and graciousness, kindness and faithfulness to each other. We fail over and over. And as God forgives our failures, we forgive each other's failures. These ways lead to life. This is the design God created for us, created in us. When we purposefully break the sacred commitment to each other's well-being, seeking only our own good, seeking dominating power, when we worship at the feet of the gods of endless consumption and violent maintenance of our superiority, we have walked away from the covenant community. These are not God's ways. These ways lead to death. As I've lived alongside the shadow of Huldah, the shadow because we don't know much about her, I've leaned in to listen to the voices of women speaking prophetically here and now, addressing the crisis of the ecological community, that is the community of all created beings, all the members of the creation that God called good, and who depend on each other's care for flourishing. In 1962, marine biologist Rachel Carson spoke urgently about the damage being done to the sacred community by the unregulated use of pesticides. In her book, Silent Spring, she writes, "We stand now where 2 roads diverge. But unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy. a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. Robin Wall Kimmerer, Native American professor of environmental and forest biology, sees that same crossroads in front of us where we must choose our future. We would need 7 planets, she says. I was afraid of this. This is my little community. We would need 7 planets, she says, to sustain the lifeways we have created. And yet those lifeways, lacking balance, justice, and peace, have not brought us contentment. Kimmerer brings a bounty of indigenous wisdom to the crossroads, guidance for protecting and sustaining our precious natural inheritance, which is one with our sacred community. Octavia Butler, acclaimed Black American writer of Afrofuturist science fiction, wades into apocalyptic futures, throwing back signal flares for us about how to avoid them. She is not optimistic that we will, but she offers visions of healing possibilities even inside the calamity. Vandana Shiva, Indian activist who advocates for the environment and critiques the global economy, draws from her education in quantum physics to look with hope on the seemingly intractable mess we've made of creation and the human community. What is in front of us is not fixed, she says. We can change this as we stay aligned with and are guided by truth. It pleases me to think of brilliant, wise Hulda standing shoulder by shoulder with these brilliant, passionate contemporary women. Together, they are holding fierce love for the covenant community of the Earth's being. They are speaking hard truths and warnings when the community breaks its sacred commitments. And they are knowing and showing the ways that lead to life, ways planted deep and reliably in our beings by our Creator. Let us follow their wisdom as we live for the sacred community.